Good evening. I guess by this time most of you know that Boston's big mid-century Jubilee begins tomorrow and lasts until the 22nd, all of which prompted several listeners to ask for a story about the greatest of all Jubilees held in Boston, right after the conclusion of the Civil War. Actually, there were two great Jubilees and peace festivals in Boston, both planned and engineered by P.S. Gilmore, one of the greatest bandmasters who ever lived. The first Peace Jubilee was in June 1869, and the second in 1872. P.S. Gilmore came from Ireland to Boston and organized his famous Gilmore's Band. He was an accomplished musician, a famous director, and the projector of the biggest and loudest band concerts the world has ever known. Most folks have the opinion that Gilmore's Great Boston Jubilee was the first of its kind in America, but that's not so. In 1864, when the Civil War was at its height, Gilmore was down in New Orleans, and to celebrate the inauguration of Governor Han, Gilmore staged a concert comprised of 10,000 voices, mostly schoolchildren, accompanied by 500 musicians, church bells, and cannon fire. And in addition, he hired 50 stalwart blacksmiths and taught them to bang on anvils like the Vulcans of old. This New Orleans concert was held on the 4th of March, 1864, and it made Mr. Gilmore famous. 2 years later, after the Civil War had ended, Gilmore went to New York and tried to interest the leading businessmen in staging a similar but bigger concert. But the Gothamites wouldn't bite. So he came back to Boston, and here in the hub, his proposition fell on more responsive ears. Naturally, there were plenty of old fogies to pour cold water on such a scheme, and many scoffed at Gilmore's proposal to construct a coliseum which would hold 1,000 musicians, 10,000 singers, and 40,000 spectators. Illustrated circulars describing the Coliseum were printed up and distributed all over the country, and here in a nutshell are the details of the whole proposition. The purpose of the 1869 National Peace Jubilee was threefold. First, to commemorate the end of hostilities between the North and South and welcome the return of peace throughout the land. Second, to provide funds for the widows and orphans of the Civil War. And third and last, to promote a national interest in vocal and instrumental music. Everybody who read the prospectus thought it was a glorious idea, but nobody came forward with funds to start the ball a-rolling. Mr. Gilmore wore himself into a frazzle, trying to find the first few thousands to get underway, and he might have failed had not the civic-minded merchant Mr. Eben Jordan donated $1,000. This was followed by investments from other leading businessmen and some mighty helpful editorials and news items in the Boston Post. This idea of having a great peace jubilee appealed to the editor of the Post, Mr. Charles Green, and he backed Gilmore to the limit. And with the backing of the Boston Post and Colonel Green, enough money came in to pay for the advance advertising. And right after that, the National Peace Jubilee Association was formed, with Honorable Alexander H. Rice as president, Eben Jordan as treasurer, Henry G. Parker as secretary, and some of the most influential men in the Commonwealth on the various committees. The contract for constructing the Coliseum was awarded to Judah Sears and Sons, but before they could deliver 3 million feet of lumber and tons of pipes and miles of wires, a storm of protest arose over the location of the Coliseum, down on the common near the public garden. The old ladies up on Beacon Hill complained it would be too noisy and the boys would trample down the grass and flowers and so forth. So some empty land was chosen where the Copley Plaza Hotel stands today. And to accommodate the thousands who would attend the festival, special tracks were laid right to the doors. And I'm going to tell you more about the big building in just a minute. Train fares and hotel rates were drastically reduced for the concert, and all up-country singers were urged to stay with friends and relatives in and around Boston. To help them find their way through our narrow, crowded streets, maps were provided, along with timetables for trains, buses, steamboats, and the horse cars. It wasn't long before choral groups all over the land were rehearsing, while back here in Boston, the director of the New England Conservatory of Music, Mr. Eben Tourget, was making arrangements to greet and gather together for the first rehearsal all of these out-of-town tenors, sopranos, altos, and basses. I have before me one of the first official announcements. It says, quotes, Grand National Peace Jubilee and Musical Festival to be held in Boston, June 15th to 19th, 1869, to commemorate the restoration of peace. The great Coliseum, the poster states, will have accommodations for 50,000 persons, where oratorios will be performed by the greatest chorus ever assembled anywhere in the world. The President of the United States and many other distinguished guests will attend. The following scale of prices has been established. Single admission with reserved seat, $5 and $3 according to location. Single admission without reserved seat, $2. Season ticket admitting 3 persons to all concerts, $100. So you see, with 40,000 odd seats available, and season tickets at $100 and reserved seats at $3 and $5 apiece, plus the other revenue they would take in, somebody stood to make a lot of money. And listen to this. The entire profits arising from this national festival will be distributed among the cities and towns throughout the country for the relief of the widows and orphans of those who fell during the rebellion. Well, now let's take a look at the Colosseum, where the concerts were held. It was 500 feet long, 300 feet wide, and the main walls were 36 feet high, and the apex of the roof stood 100 feet from the ground. 3 million feet of pine lumber was used in the construction of the Colosseum, and the frame was held together by 5 tons of bolts and spikes. When the army of carpenters laid down their hammers, they had used up 22 tons of nails. The plumbers had laid 4 miles of water and gas pipe in that vast auditorium, and in front of the balconies, which were 65 feet deep, 2,450 gas burners were installed in star-shaped clusters to provide illumination. Looking up from the floor, the 150 circular windows seemed no bigger than cartwheels. Actually, they were 18 feet in diameter. 12 doorways led into the balconies, each one 25 feet wide. The organ, built especially for the Jubilee, cost $3,000, and some of its pipes were 30 feet high. They were left exposed, and the organist faced the multitude when he played. Besides the drums of the drum corps and goodness knows how many brass bands, there was a master drum which got more newspaper space than any other single item. The drum used at the 1869 Jubilee was 8 feet across, but the one at the second Jubilee was much bigger. And here's how the papers described it. Quotes, "The huge drum, which attracts everyone's attention, was built at Farmington, Maine, and is composed of 3 separate sections of rock maple 1/8 of an inch thick, each section fastened to the other with copper bolts and special glue. 600 feet of 1-inch manila rope and 78 drum ears keep it tight and in tune. Now, as no single cowhide was large enough, several skins were pieced together, and then the heads were elaborately decorated. This is said to be the largest drum ever built. It stands 12 feet high, is 35 feet in circumference, and weighs about 600 pounds. But big though they were, neither the 8 nor 12-foot drum satisfied P.S. Gilmore. So he had the Massachusetts Volunteer Militia drag up 16 pieces of artillery, and with wires charged with electricity running from the music stand to on the platform right into the breech of the cannon, he fired the guns right in time with the music. And that isn't all. Several of Boston's biggest and best church bells were also wired up and chimed at the proper time. While these outside musical effects were swelling to the breeze, 330 stringed instruments, 119 woodwinds, 166 tubas and cornets, and 85 different drums provided the accompaniment for 10,000 trained singers. The high spot of this Jubilee was the never-to-be-forgotten rendition of the Anvil Chorus from Verdi's El Trovatore, and it was some spectacle. 100 members of the Boston Fire Department, clad in helmets and bright red shirts, marched in and banged away for all they were worth on 100 anvils. There's a fine photograph of those Boston fire laddies on exhibition right now in the main lobby of the Boston Public Library, along with pictures of P.S. Gilmore, the Colosseum, and Johann Strauss, who attended the second Jubilee. That was in 1872. This exhibit of rare photos, which you can see any day at the Public Library, was prepared by Paul Munier of Wakefield, who has spent several years in research on this subject. If any of you folks are interested in knowing more about these 2 famous Boston Jubilees, Mr. Munier has an illustrated lecture covering all the angles and details. He straightened us out on a few controversial points, and we are also indebted to Mr. Earl A. Rankin of the Department of Music at the Boston Public Library for his assistance. You know, recently the Boston papers and magazines and national publications have been commenting about these jubilees, and sometimes they get the figures and the two affairs completely mixed up, and I don't mind saying it's rather confusing. To get back to the first Jubilee, more than 200 editors and reporters covered that 1869 Jubilee, and they were royally entertained. Not all of them, however, agreed on its success. A few of the out-of-town critics complained that there was more noise than music, and one New York correspondent said, "There were very few pretty women in attendance." The Boston Traveler retorted, "The young ladies from Cape Cod and Kennebunk may not have as elaborate shoulder curls as their New York cousins, but their voices are much sweeter." The Traveler and the Post and the other papers of those days published special Jubilee editions. And in the Traveler supplement to its daily edition, we found much of the information that we are using in this broadcast. Now, about the receipts and the profits and so forth. When the Executive Committee closed its accounts, the following figures were made public. Total receipts from sale of tickets and other sources of revenue, $290,270.33. And here are the expenses in round figures. The cost of the Coliseum, $120,000. Paid musicians, $79,000. Advertising and decorations, $38,000, which with other incidentals boosted the expenses to $283,388.29, leaving a profit of only $6,882.04. This was so small, it was turned over to Mr. Gilmore, along with $33,000 derived from a benefit concert for the man who'd worked so hard to put the Jubilee over. The widows and orphans of the Civil War didn't get anything, because there wasn't anything to get. 3 years later, in June 1872, Gilmore tried it again with an international peace jubilee. He had a bigger and better Coliseum, more musicians, and far greater crowds, but when they counted up the box office receipts, there was a financial loss of somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000. Nobody ever did find out how much they lost, because somebody had printed up and sold a lot of counterfeit tickets. Both of these world-famous peace jubilees were financial flops, but for color, music, crowds, and noise, nothing like them has ever been seen or heard in Cold Roast Boston. Next week, the story of Lovewell's fight with the Indians, and it'll be a different version than most of you have heard before. The youngsters should hear this one.